In the shadowy halls of medieval power, where alliances were sealed with blood and secrets could spell the downfall of an entire state, a drama unfolded that sent shivers through an era accustomed to atrocities. A 12-year-old boy was appointed to the Senate, presented as yet another puppet on his father's chessboard. But the dynasty's triumph turned into a cruel tragedy, for the ambition of Theodore I of Montferrat knew no bounds, and his own son Octavian became an exorbitant price for his quest for dominance. The events that followed not only shattered the established notions of power and family ties, but also provoked an unforeseen transformation that jeopardized the nobility, the peasantry, and the entire kingdom. This narrative contains examples of the abuse of power and institutional violence. Depictions of cruelty will be omitted, but the facts presented are harsh and true. Nevertheless, what began as an act of violence ultimately became a lesson in resistance, whose echoes resonate to this day, centuries later. In 1387, northern Italy was ablaze with incessant conflicts. Duchies, marquisates, and prosperous mercantile republics waged fierce battles for every scrap of land, as if for precious treasure. Alliances formed with the dawn and treacherously crumbled by nightfall. In this atmosphere of widespread instability, no one could feel safe. Montferrat, a small but strategically vital marquisate, found itself caught between powerful giants, the Duchy of Milan, the House of Savoy, and city-states desperately fighting to maintain their influence. In those times, power was not a fixed inheritance for the nobility, but rather a battlefield where one had to prove their right to rule every day. And in this ceaseless war, children became valuable instruments. Appointing a child to a position of authority was a common practice, ensuring compliant votes and, more importantly, reinforcing the idea of unwavering dynastic succession. The Senate of Montferrat, formerly an advisory body, was in reality merely a facade, behind which lay the interests of the most influential families. Decisions made within its walls were prearranged in private conversations, far from the prying eyes of the populace. It was in this atmosphere of continuous wars, behind-the-scenes intrigues, and a Senate transformed into a puppet theater, that young Octavian of Montferrat was thrust into the thick of events, unaware that, to his own father, he would be not a son, but merely a pawn, ready to be sacrificed on a chessboard of grand politics. At the heart of the marquisate, within the walls of Casal Castle, Octavian of Montferrat was born. His destiny was predetermined from birth. He was a child deprived of a carefree childhood. By the age of 5, he was immersed in the study of Latin, the intricacies of diplomacy and military affairs. By 8, he attended state councils alongside adults, and at 10, he accompanied his father to negotiations upon which peace and war in the region depended. Historical chronicles of the time describe him as a youth with a perceptive gaze and a mind developed beyond his years, capable of grasping state problems with a wisdom that astonished even the most seasoned diplomats. Towering over him was his father, Theodore I, a cautious, perceptive, and deeply suspicious marquis. For him, power was synonymous with absolute control, and obedience was viewed not as a virtue, but as an unconditional duty. This chasm between father and son proved fatal. On one side, a son with an analytical mind. On the other, a father prepared to suppress him in the name of his dynasty's immutability. At the age of 12, Octavian was granted the title of Senator of the Marquisate. The ceremony, held in Casale Cathedral, was marked by particular solemnity. Sumptuous purple robes richly adorned with gold embroidery, oaths sworn before the nobility and clergy, and a young boy who became the personification of the dynastic future. To many, this event seemed a mere political maneuver, but something more than mere obedience lay hidden within this child. For many months, Octavian meticulously performed the role his father had defined for him. He diligently attended every session, remained silent, and consistently voted according to instructions. He was no more than an obedient figure on Theodore's chessboard. However, over time, changes began to occur in his consciousness. Octavian started to realize the true significance of the decisions made in that hall. He saw how new taxes led to the ruin of peasants and merchants, and understood with bitterness that the voice of the common people never reached these walls. In February 1388, a pivotal moment arrived. The Senate was debating a plan for a military campaign against the Duchy of Savoy to be financed by the imposition of new taxes. Against his father's wishes, Octavian rose from his seat. With firmness in his voice, he declared that such a burden would lead the populace to utter destitution and inevitably spark a rebellion. A silence fell over the hall. Senators, well versed in intrigue, watched in astonishment as the youth dared to challenge the Marquis himself in everyone's presence. Theodore, red with fury, ordered him to be silent and sit down. From that moment, the father ceased to see his son as an obedient heir, beginning to perceive him as a genuine threat. After that memorable address in the Senate, the relationship between Octavian and Theodore changed forever. What began as a simple disagreement escalated into a hidden war within the castle. The Marquis, unable to tolerate dissent within his own family, decided to tighten his control over his son. He replaced the humanist tutors who fostered Octavian's critical thinking with strict teachers who instilled only one lesson: unquestioning obedience. He forbade him from meeting other young nobles, fearing the spread of rebellious sentiments, and confined him to an increasingly narrow, controlled, and isolated circle. The authoritarian Theodore made a fatal error, interpreting silence as a sign of unquestioning submission. Young Octavian, contrary to his father's expectations, did not break under the yoke of despotism, but found hidden ways to express his protest. Secretly delving into philosophical treatises in Latin, he gradually formed a circle of like-minded individuals among the impoverished nobility and began to harbor subversive ideas, questioning the immutability of his father's power. The Marquis, naively believing he had managed to suppress any manifestation of defiance in its infancy, had in fact become the unwitting instigator of a burgeoning flame that threatened to rage out of control. In a spacious hall, lit by flickering candles and adorned with maps, the highest officials of the Marquisate discussed strategies to counter the pressure from the powerful Milanese duchy. Everyone present expected nothing but blind obedience from the young senator, but Octavian, barely 13 years of age, made a decision that astonished even the most seasoned politicians. Convinced that the common peasants would be the inevitable victims of the impending war, he passed secret information to the enemy's envoys, hoping that in return they would show respect for the rights of ordinary people. When news of this audacious act reached Theodore, his world was shaken. For the Marquis, Obsessed with the idea of total control, this was not merely a boyish rebellion or a display of naivety, but a true betrayal. And worst of all, a betrayal committed by his own son. The council hall was instantly filled with an atmosphere of unbearable tension. The nobles whispered, suggesting various punishments. Send him to a monastery, exile him so we never see him again, lock him in a dungeon until he comes to his senses. But Theodore paid no attention to their words. His gaze, cold and unmoving, was fixed on nothingness. A sinister plan, devoid of all pity, was forming in his mind. If his own son dared to challenge him, he could well become a symbol of resistance, and a symbol, as is known, is far more dangerous than any army. Therefore, Theodore made an irrevocable decision to destroy everything that made Octavian an heir, a man, and a potential rival. On that fateful night, as the castle plunged into deep silence, something dreadful occurred, predetermining the tragic fate of the young senator. This fate proved more terrible than the cruelest customs of the Middle Ages and left an indelible mark on the history of Montferrat. After that night, Octavian seemed to vanish into thin air. The Marquis publicly announced that his son was gravely ill and required solitude for his recovery. However, with each public event the youth missed, unease grew. How could such a promising young senator show no signs of recovery for so long? The junior nobles, who saw Octavian as a voice for their interests in the Senate, began to show clear alarm. Some insistently requested an audience to visit him, but all their pleas were rejected on flimsy pretexts. He has a high fever and is not receiving visitors. Behind the impregnable castle walls, servants whispered about what no one dared to voice aloud, that the youth was no longer himself, that his personality had changed, that he had been silenced forever. The church also did not remain aloof. The Bishop of Casale, disturbed by the spreading rumors, requested a private meeting with the Marquis. He suspected that something sinister lay behind this supposed illness. Meanwhile, in the town squares, the common people conversed amongst themselves with indignation. For them, Octavian was no traitor. He was the youth who had boldly defended the poor against new taxes in the Senate. His disappearance was perceived as a cruel punishment for speaking the truth. Prayers for the young man's recovery gradually transformed into hidden protests, veiled as religious rites. Beneath the flickering candles and collective prayers, a dangerous sentiment, a subversive thought, began to stir that even the Marquis's boundless power could be questioned. While gossip spread beyond the castle walls, Octavian, deprived of his usual company and under constant surveillance, waged his own unseen struggle. In isolation and stripped of his former freedom, he, contrary to expectations, chose a path of hidden resistance. Outwardly demonstrating obedience, deep down he carefully cherished memories of his days in the Senate. Recreating political battles in his mind and devising alternative solutions, he honed his strategic thinking. Secretly, Octavian began to keep records. Using homemade ink, recycled paper, and quills found in the courtyard, he filled pages with political reflections, plans for reform, and descriptions of his surroundings. His imprisonment, strangely enough, played into his hands, allowing him to remain close to the Marquis. Theodore, confident in his son's neutralization, did not hesitate to discuss confidential matters in his presence, inadvertently providing Octavian with valuable information about the impending crisis. Furthermore, the youth maintained contact with the castle servants, who, remembering his respectful treatment, became his eyes and ears in the outside world. Through them, he learned of the growing discontent among the peasants and the diplomatic pressure exerted on his father. Without weapons or an army at his disposal, Octavian discovered something more powerful. True resistance is born in the mind, and even in silence, one can prepare the ground for future changes. The winter of 1389 descended upon the marquisate not only with biting cold, but also with ominous portents of impending disaster. News from the borders, like peals of thunder, announced an approaching threat. Milan and Savoy, having formed an alliance, were preparing to invade, their armies like predatory beasts, ready to tear apart the marquisate's lands. Within the country, the situation was no less explosive. The peasants, whose backs were bent under the burden of exorbitant taxes that had drained them of their last vitality for years, rose up against their oppressors. Consumed by fury, they set fire to barns, symbols of their poverty, and meted out summary justice to hated tax collectors. For the first time in his long years of rule, Theodore I, once seemingly unshakable, found himself in a situation from which he saw no escape. The Marquis, known for his composure and shrewdness, now, like a shadow, roamed the castle corridors, plunged into the abyss of despair. Advisers, like ravens gathered on carrion, offered contradictory solutions, from humiliating negotiations to ignominious flight, or the brutal suppression of the rebellion with blood and fire. None of the proposed options promised salvation. Octavian, observing his father during these anxious nights, saw before him not an all-powerful ruler who inspired fear and awe, but a bewildered man who had lost control of the situation. Every gesture of despair, every stifled sigh, merely confirmed what Octavian had long suspected. Making his secret notes, the marquisate was balancing on the edge of an abyss, and in this precarious crack of weakness, Octavian saw his chance. He understood that his father, blinded by pride and prejudice, could never entertain the thought that the very son he had so long tried to silence would be the only one who could save him and the marquisate from inevitable ruin. One night, bound by frost, Marquis Theodore I collapsed into a chair, broken by the weight of circumstances. Enemy hordes, ready for conquest, stood just 2 days' march from his castle, and the surrounding villages blazed with popular revolt. For the first time in a long while, the unshakable Theodore I seemed defeated even before the decisive battle began. And then something incredible happened. Octavian, his taciturn son, a youth who had until then remained in the shadow of his father's glory, suddenly spoke. But his voice held no victim's plea. Instead, he spoke as a wise adviser. "Father," he said firmly, "I have meticulously analyzed this crisis for several weeks and am convinced there is a way out. Theodore I shot him an angry, furious look. How dare this boy interfere in affairs of state? Yet, in the depths of his eyes, a flicker of despair and hope appeared. The ensuing hours Octavian dedicated to a detailed exposition of his plan, which, in its foresight, surpassed the boldest calculations of the Marquis's experienced advisers. He proposed luring the enemies to the negotiating table, not as conquerors, but as potential trade partners. Theodore's marquisate controlled key trade routes leading to the Mediterranean Sea, and it was this wealth that enticed Milan and Savoy. Simultaneously, Octavian suggested implementing radical tax reforms, unprecedented until then, to lighten the burden on the peasants, to restore their incentive to work, and thereby increase the crown's revenues in the long term. This was an audacious and revolutionary strategy, unthinkable in an age mired in wars and brutal repression. But for the first time in many months, Theodore the Freysa heard words that instilled hope for salvation. On that fateful night, the son he had for years tried to keep in the shadows became the only one whose voice could save the marquisate from inevitable ruin. Octavian's conceived plan began to take concrete form, yet not everyone was prepared to accept it unconditionally. At meetings of the ruling elite, the most entrenched members of the nobility seethed, shouting accusations of treason. They deemed it unacceptable to trade with those who had once sought to seize their lands and to reduce the tax burden on commoners, which, in their view, would inevitably lead to the collapse of the established feudal order. For these conservatives, the young senator's proposals sounded like political sacrilege, as they implied the abandonment of privileges that the aristocracy had guarded for generations. However, Octavian, undeterred, displayed remarkable diplomatic skill. He meticulously studied the motives, fears, and vulnerabilities of each of his opponents and systematically began to neutralize them. To Count Castelmonte, the fiercest of his adversaries, he revealed a secret that rendered him speechless. It turned out that deposits of high-quality salt lay hidden on his lands. Thanks to the opening trade routes, this resource could multiply his fortune to unprecedented scales. Faced with the prospect of either losing everything or gaining immense wealth, the Count changed his stance, and many others followed his example. Like a skilled chess player, Octavian methodically transformed the council hall into an arena for the realization of his own designs. He achieved his goals not through force of arms or grand pronouncements, but through subtle strategy, foresight, and a remarkable gift for persuasion, hardly expected from a youth who had known bitter loss early in life. The one who was once forced into silence now compelled the most influential magnates of the marquisate to heed every word he spoke. What many initially regarded as recklessness gradually transformed into a genuine political metamorphosis. The agreements concluded with Milan and Savoy not only averted the threat of war, but also transformed recent adversaries into business partners, deeply invested in the marquisate's prosperity. The trade routes leading to the Mediterranean were once again filled with caravans laden with goods, which swiftly impacted the state's prosperity. Simultaneously, the tax reforms began to bear fruit. Peasants, freed from an unbearable burden, gained the opportunity to revive production. Crop yields increased, markets revived, and with them, treasury revenues reached unprecedented heights. However, the most significant changes occurred not in the economy, but in social life. For the first time, representatives of the nobility, merchants, and peasantry gained a common platform for dialogue, consultative assemblies established on Octavian's initiative. Here, voices that had previously gone unheard now had the opportunity to be heard, and pressing issues found prompt and equitable resolution. The marquisate, which had teetered on the brink of collapse, was reborn, becoming more prosperous, stable, and unified than ever before. And at the head of this process stood he, the youth who, having lost everything, managed to transform his pain into a strength capable of changing the course of his people's history. The young man once humiliated and silenced, ascended to the political zenith, becoming a figure representing more than mere leadership. Octavian managed to transform personal tragedy into a rare gift of empathy, which set him apart from other nobles. He knew firsthand what it was like to lose everything, and this experience shaped him into a ruler of a fundamentally different kind. Visiting remote villages, he did not surround himself with guards, seeking to impose his will, but rather listened attentively to the needs of ordinary people. Octavian found time to converse with the elderly, widows, and peasants struggling to make ends meet, striving to find individual solutions for each problem. Such an approach to governance not only caused surprise, but also inspired the populace. Soon, his image ceased to be associated with a punished son, transforming into a symbol of hope for thousands. Octavian also proved himself a talented writer, working diligently on his treatises. From his pen came the Treatises of Montferrat, documents in which he expounded his views on justice, reconciliation, and the true purpose of power. These texts, anticipating modern ideals of human rights and democracy, would be studied centuries later as a valuable source of wisdom. Thus, the youth, ostracized and having experienced his father's cruelty, transformed into a man he could never have imagined, a guiding star for his own time and for future generations. Octavian of Montferrat passed away in his prime, barely 26 years old. However, his burial ceremony starkly contrasted with typical noble funerals. Humble farmers, skilled artisans, clergy, and even high-ranking foreign diplomats arrived to pay their respects to the deceased. Every attendee recognized they were witnessing an exceptional event. Octavian's life, overshadowed by his father's despotism, transformed into a symbol of justice and harmony. His messages and deeds became precursors to ideas which, centuries later, would inspire the formation of new governance systems and the affirmation of human dignity. Octavian's story serves as a reminder that even in the bleakest circumstances, an unwavering spirit can transform suffering into strength and abuses of power into a source of hope, prompting everyone to reflect, how would we wield the power we possess, however insignificant it may seem, to stand up for those who are most vulnerable